teachers and dear friends. Very warm good evening. With immense pleasure, we invite all of you to the guest lecture series organized by the Department of Pediatrics, SIT Hospital, Trivandrum and IAP Trivandrum. Today is the fourth lecture in the series, and we have an excellent speaker with us, Dr. Guru Prasad, the Associate Professor, Department of Pediatric Oncology, Regional Cancer Center, Trivandrum. I first invite Dr. Ajit Krishnan, Professor and Head, the Department of Pediatrics, SIT Hospital, Trivandrum, for a welcome note.
Thank you, Minna. Good evening to all. So, respected teachers, senior pediatricians, Purushottam sir is here, and then IAP Trivandrum President Santosh Kumar sir, Secretary Dr. Praveen, and Dr. Riaz, National Executive Board Member, then our own faculty, my dear postgraduates, and all other pediatricians. Today, we have the fourth of the guest lecture series from the Department of Pediatrics, SIT Hospital. We are doing this in association with IAP Thiruvananthapuram. The topic today is approach to suspected disease case of childhood malignancy. Regarding the topic, the childhood malignancy is often difficult to detect in the early stages because the associated signs and symptoms are non-specific, insidious in onset, and mimic other common disorders. So today's lecture will provide an overview of presentation of childhood malignancy and outline the general principles of evaluation. So we have with us Dr. Guru Prasad, Associate Professor, Pediatric Oncology, Regional Cancer Center, Trivandrum. And he is our own student and alumni of SIT Hospital. So over to Minnu. So Santosh sir will introduce the speaker.
Thank you, sir. I now invite Dr. A. Santosh Kumar, President, IAP Trivandrum, the former Superintendent and HOD of Pediatric Department, SIT Hospital, to please introduce the guest.
Thank you. Good evening, all. And I thank Dr. Ajit and the Department of Pediatrics for giving me this opportunity. And I congratulate Dr. Ajit Krishnan for this idea of guest lectures, monthly guest lectures of topics that are not usually discussed in our forum. So let it be there continuously so that we people also will get benefited. And ever since we stopped treating leukemia, malignancies have become sort of alien area for all of us, particularly for me. And that's what I was telling Dr. Guru, that that is the reason why I am forced to call him off and on. And thank you for responding to my queries. Now, Doctor, I have a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Guru because he was one of the very enthusiastic students of our college, our alumni, and now in RCC, Pediatric Oncology, Associate Professor now. And he has done his DM from RCC only in oncology. And he has a special interest in critical care of neutropenic patients and pediatric HSCT. Organizational positions, especially as far as IAP is concerned, he was both the secretary and president of hemato-oncology chapter of IAP. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Guru Prasad to present his topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it visible? Is the slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you, Santosh sir and Ajit sir, for having me in this lecture series. But with a small correction, I would like to remove the guest part of the guest lecture series, because I'm sure I'm not guest, I am family. So let me start off my topic by extending my greetings from my center, Regional Cancer Center. So the topic given to me for today's discussion is pediatric cancers, when to suspect and how to approach. So as Ajit sir has already said, the difficulty in diagnosing a pediatric malignancy comes from the fact that it is a very rare scenario. It is not like adult malignancy. Pediatric malignancy in itself is a very, very rare. Of the total cancers, pediatric malignancy contribute only to less than 5% of total cancers. So that makes the cancer itself is a rare diagnosis, and among cancers, pediatric malignancy is less than 5%. Often the signs and symptoms are very non-specific, and it overlaps with the signs and symptoms that are seen in common benign conditions. So when to suspect is definitely a query, a very big query. When to suspect a pediatric malignancy when a patient comes to you with the common signs and symptoms. Now, another thing is a diagnosis of malignancy is a very big stigma on a family. Not just an emotional stigma, it is an economic stigma also. So the point of alerting parents is also critical. Like when I am thinking of a malignancy, I should not be telling them at the first point itself that I am thinking of a malignancy. I should be telling them only when I am sure that there is no going back from that diagnosis. So the point of alerting parents is also very important, and hence the breaking the bad news, the importance of breaking the bad news. Now, coming to the incidence, as I told, it is rare. If you go through various data, like the SEER data shows that it is only around 14 out of 10,000 cases. So that is from a long periods of data collection. ICMR has collected an incident, and they have found around 75 per 100,000. That is 75 cases per million. So this doesn't mean much from a practical point of view. I would look at it in a different, we will look at the same point in a different way. So this was one study, an interesting study that was published in BJC. This was collected from data from NHS in UK. So they found that for a solo practicing pediatrician, in his entire lifetime, he will come across probably 2 malignancy diagnoses. Rest of all the diagnoses in his entire lifetime will be only benign. So if he's sitting as a solo practitioner in the center, he will come across a malignancy once in 20 years in his OPD. So that is the rarity of the diagnosis. Also, with the experience gained from diagnosing the first malignancy cannot be used to diagnose the next malignancy, because first malignancy that he may diagnose will be a Wilms tumor. Next one that is coming to he will be an acute leukemia. So the experience that he gains from diagnosing a Wilms tumor cannot be used to diagnose a acute leukemia. So there is, so probably I'm sure I'm making clear the difficulty that would be faced by a pediatrician. These are other data that came in the same study, that multiple provider centers diagnose a malignancy in 5 to 7 years. The lag time between the first and second case is very different, very prolonged. But when you come to an ER setting, when you come to an ER setting, the diagnosis is around 7%. That is 7 cases out of 100 cases coming to an ER setting is likely to be a malignancy. Hence the importance of educating ER physicians. So this is Indian data, which was published in Indian Pediatrics. This is based on a hospital-based registry. And as we all know, the common diagnosis are leukemia and lymphoma, followed by CNS tumors. RCC data is also in the same lines, and it is in it is similar to data from other centers across the world. This is SEER data. here again, the pattern is similar. Now coming to the dilemmas, as I already told the first few points, it is the common signs and symptoms, the rarity. Another difficulty is for a general pathologist to make a diagnosis. It is very difficult because they come across a malignant slide only once in a while. So it has been found that if you review centrally, the chance of re-diagnosing a malignancy is higher if you have a central pathology review by a experienced oncopathologist. Another dilemma is convincing the parents. Now, time to diagnosis and its significance. So this is one point which comes to everybody's mind. Like if because of my lack of skill, whether the delay in diagnosis will affect the survival of the child. So the delay in diagnosis can be due to many reasons, like it can be disease related, it can be patient or parent related, or it can be healthcare associated. Disease related, like if you have a Wilms tumor, you diagnose it very early because parents will pick the mass soon and they will come to you. But if it is a Hodgkin, many of the time it presents with a lymph node, which is a common presentation in pediatric OPD. So there will be a long lag time between the onset and the diagnosis. Parents' education is an important factor. Another important thing is patient-related factors. In an adolescent boy developing a testicular tumor, they may not tell parents. So that will cause a delay in diagnosis. Another is healthcare related because of our lack of knowledge. Now, does early diagnosis transform into better outcomes? This is a very big query. It is not like we think. Most of the time, the prognosis or outcome depends on the biology of cancer rather than the time of diagnosis. There are few diagnoses like Wilms tumor. If you diagnose early, you have a better outcome. Retinoblastoma, you diagnose early, you have better outcome. But there have been studies in solid tumors like bone tumors where the outcome does not relate to the timing of diagnosis because it has been found that the outcome is more related to the biology of cancer rather than the time of diagnosis. And cancer that has an aggressive biology, even if you diagnose early, like a neuroblastoma, if you diagnose early or you diagnose late, it will behave badly. So it is more related to the biology of the tumor rather than timing of diagnosis. But definitely there are tumors like Hodgkin, retinoblastoma, things which have relation to early diagnosis. Now, let's go to the topic. Now, who are the children at risk? What are the presentation and how do we investigate? Now, who are the children at risk? There are some genetic predisposition like Down syndrome, neurofibromatosis, Beck-Friedman, as we know, are directly related to malignancies. Gestational age, premature infants have been related to development of hepatoblastoma. So, a baby which is low birth weight and who have had an NICU admission has a higher risk of developing hepatoblastoma. There is no definite pathophysiological association. We don't know how it is related. But if you look back at hepatoblastoma diagnosis, majority of them are low birth weight or who have gone through NICU. Many of the explanations given are that a baby that is going through NICU, the liver has to go through lot of exposure like drugs, antibiotics, oxygen, furosemide during a period when the liver is still immature. That is one explanation given to development of hepatoblastoma in very premature infants. As we know, many viral agents like EBV, hepatitis have been related. EBV has been related to Hodgkin, hepatitis to hepatocellular carcinoma, even though it is not in pediatric age group. HIV has been related to CNS lymphomas. That is seen in pediatric age group itself. Many immunosuppressive therapy can be related to organ transplant, it can be post-transplant lymphoproliferative syndrome. Even chemotherapy has been related to second malignancies. Cancer survivors, as I told now, is related has a higher risk of malignancy because of alkylating agent, cranial radiotherapy, procarbazine, things like that have an excess risk of malignancy. Another important thing, what is the risk of ionizing radiation? This is one question that is asked to us by many bystanders. Will the X-ray taken for my child increase the risk of malignancy? There has been no data connecting the investigational radiation exposure to malignancy development. The radiation exposure that is related to malignancy are the radiation that is related to nuclear events like the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, things like that is related to malignancy and not the simple X-ray. Now, what are the presentations and investigations? So I'm repeating this point because the non-specific presentation is the one that makes it difficult. The diagnosis, the challenge. Now, I will discuss these points because these are the most common situations where you confuse with common benign diagnosis. Fever, lymphadenopathy, a thoracic mass, bone and joint pain, a CNS mass, and an abdominal mass. If you have a bleeding child, we'll definitely look for a malignancy. So I won't be looking into those things. So these are the common presentations which needs further discussion. So coming to fever first. When you see a case of fever in OPD, infection is your first diagnosis. Inflammation, you may have many diagnoses other than this, but malignancy comes very down in the list. Now, if you follow up a prolonged fever of unknown origin, around 10% of it will ultimately turn out to be malignancy. So in a FUO or fear of unknown origin, malignancy should be there in your mind. So 10% means if you see a 10 cases, one will turn out to be a malignancy. Now, when is a fever significant or a fever that is related to malignancy? A fever that is associated with weight loss, associated with pallor, bone pain, a mass, abnormal counts, ESR, LDH, uric acid, or an associated abnormal chest X-ray. When all these are inconclusive, then we have to look into an ultrasound abdomen to look for a significant nodal pathology or a splenic pathology to look for any evidence of malignancy. Even that is normal, then we have to think of a bone marrow. But when you are thinking of a bone marrow, you should be seriously thinking of a diagnosis of malignancy because you have to alert the parents. Now the role of informing the parents comes. When you're looking at a CBC or an ultrasound abdomen, your blood biochemistry like LDH, maybe you needn't tell parents. But when you're thinking of a bone marrow, probably you should alert parents that malignancy is probably in my duties. Now, what are the common malignancies that presents as FUO? Acute leukemia and lymphoma, as we know, is a common diagnosis. But other malignancies that we have to keep in mind is Langerhans and histiocytosis can present with fever. Ewing sarcoma can present with fever. Another is a solid tumor inside the abdomen that is undergoing necrosis will release cytokines and cause fever. A metastatic neuroblastoma can present with fever. So apart from leukemia, lymphoma, there are solid tumors as well which presents with fever. Now coming to lymphadenopathy. So it is a very common symptom. So what I would suggest everyone is that whenever you see a lymphadenopathy, a malignancy should be there in your mind. But don't discuss that with your parents. But whenever you see a lymphadenopathy, always like as a pediatrician, when I was working as a pediatrician, when I see a lymphadenopathy, I always think, oh, this is a benign thing. But now as an oncologist, I have now started saying to others that don't keep any lymphadenopathy, don't take any lymphadenopathy as benign. You can work up and treat, work up for benign condition, but a malignant diagnosis should always be in your mind. But at that point, never discuss that with your parents. Go ahead with your workup. Other causes of lymphadenopathy are more common. So this is one sentence which I found in PISO, which is a textbook of pediatric oncology. So it says that almost all palpable lymph nodes are not pathologically enlarged, and almost all pathologically enlarged lymph nodes have a benign pathology. So even in a pathologically enlarged lymph node, the diagnosis is almost always benign. Malignancy is less common. So how do you look at a lymph node? So for making a diagnosis, you look at the site, size, and age of the child. So the importance of size is that a supraclavicular node should always be taken as pathologically enlarged. It is very unlikely to be a benign diagnosis. You should always keep a malignancy in your top in your list. Left side is usually a diagnosis from below diaphragm like a testicular tumor or a RMS in the retroperitoneum. Right side is an intrathoracic mass. Coming to size, as we all know, an epitrochlear more than 0.5, 1 centimeter cervical and inguinal 1.5. Coming to age, a younger child presenting with lymph node, the probable diagnosis are neuroblastoma, RMS, LML, and NHL, non-Hodgkin's, and ALL. But in an older child, NHL and HL are more common. Rare RMS comes lower down. In a very older child, so this is a very important age group, more than 13-year-old child coming with a cervical lymph node. Nasopharyngeal carcinoma should always be there in your mind. Second, an important diagnosis is a thyroid malignancy. So these are two things which we have found that many of the time people miss. So as isolated lymphadenopathy presenting in an older child, in an adolescent, apart from leukemia, lymphoma, and lymphoma, nasopharyngeal carcinoma should be done. An important history that you have to take is the history of snoring. Now, based on distribution, what is the importance? A localized lymph node that is fluctuant, tender, associated with high fever, I am not concerned. It is likely to be an infection. Matted, etc. are likely to be infection. Look for all draining sites. What are the concerning symptoms? A lymph node associated with prolonged fever, as we have already told, associated with weight loss. A node that is large, that is non-tender, rapidly enlarging, and becoming fixed. So this is a very important feature. A node that is becoming fixed to the adjacent structure, that is showing its malignant potential. It is invading the surrounding tissues. And a node that is involving supraclavicular region. So a non-tender, a node that is not causing any issue for the child, is a concerning node. Now, when there are no issues in the draining sites and you are not thinking of an infection, always do a CBC. Take a chest X-ray. Rule out infectious causes with Mando viral serology. Do give a trial of antibiotic. Still inconclusive, go for a biopsy. So these are the concerning symptoms: a prolonged fever, weight loss, a large node which is not associated with pain, a node that is rapidly enlarging, becoming fixed, and a node that is involving supraclavicular. Now, how do you approach? This is one approach given in pediatric textbook of pediatric oncology. So we will cut into each part and see. So suppurative lymph node, it is easy to work up, whether it is confluent or whether it is fluctuant or non-fluctuant. In a non-fluctuant lymph node, you should think of a malignancy diagnosis. After ruling out all benign causes, if it is still not diagnostic, definitely go for a biopsy. When it is non-suppurative, so this is a situation where you are concerned. So when there is a non-suppurative lymph node, or there is no or evidence of it, I am really a bit concerned. I will definitely look for a CBC and chest X-ray. When it is associated with concerning symptoms, as I previously mentioned, like it is non-associated with no pain, adhering to the surrounding tissues, no fever, probably I will slightly tell parents that I am concerned. Now, how do I approach this lymph node? Definitely look for a CBC, take a chest X-ray, look for the concerning symptoms, do a bone marrow. If after the same thing I'm coming, when all investigations, like as I told before, when all these investigations are normal, when all the investigations are normal, probably infection, most of the time it is infection, but I will give a trial of antibiotics. But when it is non-suppurative, I will definitely go for a biopsy. So this is a point, you leave that chart, this is the point that I am coming to. So a chronic, persistent, progressive adenopathy that is prolonged more than 6 weeks, a node that is more than 2.5 centimeter, a supraclavicular adenopathy, and associated with some systemic symptoms, always do go for a biopsy. But a 2.5 centimeter size, I have put this because it is I have taken from various studies. But that depends on the clinical scenario as well. A node that is 6 centimeters should always be biopsied. It is not that you should wait for a 6 weeks time. So a significant node should always be biopsy. Now coming to thoracic mass. So this is also a concern because most of the time in young child, a thoracic mass is most often a thymic mass. So when is a but thymic mass usually have its characteristic features. Patient will not have any symptoms due to the mass. The margins will be very clear. The classic sale sign will be there. Now, most series have found that around 50% of thoracic mass can be malignant, and it can present as asymptomatic or have a symptomatic presentation. Symptomatic presentation can be due to airway obstruction, vessels, or obstruction of other structures. So other structure is shown in this figure. If you look at closely, the child has the right eye there is the palpebral fissure is smaller, suggesting that it is infiltrating into the neural structures. Now, how do you approach? So when you have a child with thoracic mass, the point to be considered is that most commonly it is lymphoma diagnosis. Lymphoma leukemia is a diagnosis. Whenever I take a class, I usually tell the first diagnosis lymphoma leukemia, second diagnosis lymphoma leukemia, third diagnosis lymphoma leukemia. So that should be your first diagnosis. After that, you can think of other diagnoses like solid tumors. The most common solid tumors that has to be considered is a germ cell tumor. Another is a Ewing sarcoma, which is involving the chest wall or rib and sternum. So those are the solid tumors that commonly present as anterior mediastinal mass. Now, we have to look at the baseline investigation. What are the points to be kept in mind when you are approaching a child with mediastinal mass? Look at the baseline investigations. What does it suggest? Whether the patient is symptomatic or not. Whether a biopsy is possible and what are the anesthesia risks for a biopsy. So these are the points to be kept in mind to make a diagnosis. Does the baseline investigation give us a diagnosis? Is the patient symptomatic so that you need an urgent intervention? Whether a biopsy is possible and what are the anesthesia risks. So all this have to be kept in mind to decide on whether an urgent empirical treatment is needed or not. So what are the basic approach? If the first line approach that is needed are you send a CBC, you have a high count, you can think of leukemia. Send a peripheral smear, fine blast, you can think of leukemia. You don't have to go for a biopsy from the mass. If these two are normal, the other sites where you can get a diagnosis, other than poking the mediastinal mass, is go for a bone marrow biopsy, bone marrow aspiration. Another is look for a lymph node in all lymph node regions. Get a biopsy from the lymph node. When you're doing a bone marrow biopsy, always do in a sitting position. Don't do it in a lying down position because that will compress when you make the patient into the C position, it will compress the airway. Looking for solid tumors where you can make a diagnosis without a biopsy, you are sending tumor markers. Send an AFP, alpha fetoprotein and beta HCG. If they are raised, you can think of germ cell tumors. But for an Ewing sarcoma, you definitely need a diagnosis, need a biopsy. So if any of these results are pointing towards a diagnosis, treat accordingly. Don't poke the mediastinum. Now, if the first line investigations are inconclusive, like count is normal, marrow is normal, everything is normal. Now we need a specimen from the marrow, from the mediastinum to get a biopsy. Now, so to get a diagnosis from the specimen, what you need is a sedation or an anesthesia. So next what we have to see is what is the anesthesia risk of this patient. And so that we can perform the least invasive procedure. So during GA, what are our concerns? A GA or a sedation will decrease the respiratory muscle tone, abdominal muscle tone, it will move the diaphragm proximally, bronchial muscle tones will go, and lung volume diminish, and patient may go into respiratory failure. So if the patient is anesthesia low risk, how do you decide whether the patient is anesthesia low risk or high risk? You have a CT with you. Look at the CT. The most important point is you have to look at how much the airway is compressed. If the airway is compressed more than 40 to 50%, don't go for a sedation. Because the reason is, if the airway is compressed more than 40 to 50%, the patient goes into a respiratory failure during your procedure, and you have to intubate. and connect to a ventilator. The concern is the airway is compressed more than 50%, means the PEEP that you provide from the ventilator will not reach the alveoli. So an airway that is compressed more than 40% or 50%, don't attempt any sedation. So how do you approach that patient? The patient is having respiratory distress, airway is compressed more than 50%. So that means the patient is going into respiratory failure. There comes the role of what is called a gentle chemotherapy in the management of life-threatening mediastinal mass where biopsy is impossible. So what is this gentle chemotherapy? So that goes with your common DDs. So as I told, the first diagnosis is leukemia lymphoma. So consider giving corticosteroid. There is no guideline on which corticosteroids to be used. It can be prednisolone, it can be dexamethasone. Both can be used. What we commonly use is dexamethasone. Not at a dose of around 20 mg per meter square. But when you are giving dexamethasone, the points to be kept in mind is that always start a tumor lysis prophylaxis, tumor lysis syndrome prophylaxis along with starting dexamethasone. Because if it happens to be a lymphoma leukemia, once you start steroid, the patient will go into tumor lysis. So hydration has to be started, allopurinol, sevelamer, potassium binders, etc. has to be started before starting the steroids. So now the next dilemma comes. If it is responding, it is likely to be a lymphoma leukemia. But another important point to be kept in mind is that once you are starting the patient on a steroid, the patient has to be in an ICU setting and patient has to be monitored every 4th hourly for anesthesia. At the first point of time the patient becomes low anesthesia, you should consider a biopsy, because once the patient is on steroids for around 48 hours, the chance of getting a diagnosis diminishes because the tumor becomes necrotic. Now, what are the DDs to be considered once the patient is not responding after 1 or 2 days of steroids? So after 1 or 2 days of steroids, the patient is not responding means you have to consider 2 things. Either the first is it is not a lymphoma leukemia. It is likely to be a solid tumor. Another point to be kept in mind is that the tumor has already produced a superior vena cava thrombus that is not lysing. So that can be diagnosed by taking a chest X-ray after 48 hours. The mass would have decreased inside, but the facial puffiness, dilated neck veins are still persisting. That means the thrombus is there in the superior vena cava that is causing persistence of symptoms and not the tumor. So 2 points has to be kept in mind: whether it is a different diagnosis or is it a thrombus in the superior vena cava that is causing the symptoms. So if it is if there is no thrombus, you have to think of solid tumors. If it is solid tumors, probably you will have to give chemotherapy, which includes anthracycline, alkylating agents, and vincristine. And when this is needed, probably you should get an oncologist in the loop. So this is what I already told. When you have a superior mediastinal syndrome, get a chest X-ray, find a mass, send a CBC, send an AFP as well as beta CG along with it, peripheral smear as well as. If it is diagnostic, treat accordingly. If it is not diagnostic, stabilize the patient and assess anesthesia risk. Low risk for anesthesia, take a biopsy, treat accordingly. If anesthesia high risk, go for a gentle chemotherapy, reassess. At the first point of time, patient become stable for anesthesia, do a biopsy. Now coming to bone and joint pain. So this is again a common symptom in pediatric practice. So what are the joint pain that are important? A joint pain that is waking the child up from severe enough to wake the child up from sleep, or that is a persistent low back pain, which can be a sign of cord compression. A back pain that is associated with bladder symptoms or gait abnormality, think about malignancy. So what are the common malignancy? Again, lymphoma leukemia is the first BD, but other points to be kept in mind is neuroblastoma. It's a very common differential diagnosis in a child presenting with back pain and neurological symptoms. Osteosarcoma and Ewing sarcoma can present with bone pains. Another important diagnosis is the Langerhans histiocytosis, especially in an adolescent child presenting with a localized bone pain and having a lytic lesion. LCH should be kept in mind. And so where are the places where we go wrong? Most of the time we attribute bone pains in the child to trauma, or we neglect it as growing pain. So always look for a soft tissue mass. Whenever a person is telling a bone pain, look for a soft tissue mass along with it. Because it can be a presentation of LCH as well as localized lymphoma. So that are the DDs to be kept in mind when you're looking at a localized pain. In a diffuse or a multifocal pain, the points DDs to be kept in mind are leukemia, neuroblastoma. Another important DD is multifocal Ewing sarcoma. It is a very rare diagnosis, but we have come across a few cases. But the common things to be kept in mind when a patient presents with multifocal bone pain is acute leukemia as well as neuroblastoma. Now, JR is the most important DD that confuses us. So, what are the pointers towards a malignancy? The early morning sickness is very uncommon in a malignant diagnosis. The pain in malignancy is more during night. The pain is disproportionate to the inflammation. There may not be much joint swelling or any swelling around the bone, but there will be significant pain. They tend to shift in location, and as well as they may involve both joint as well as bone. So a pain that is caused involving both bone as well as joints, think of a malignancy diagnosis. A constitutional symptoms that can be present in JRI as well. Associated high ESR can be present in JRI. But an important point to be kept in mind is that a bone or a joint pain that is associated with thrombocytopenia is more likely to be a malignancy rather than a JRI. Because most of the time JRI presents with thrombocytosis, except from when they develop macrophage activation syndromes. Coming to intracranial mass, because of the anatomical restraint caused by the skull, most of them present early. When they have an intracranial mass, they have an early symptoms. Delay in diagnosis is usually more common in supratentorial mass, and that also in infants, where the AF is still. Coming to the signs and symptoms, there are many general symptoms as well as localizing symptoms. What are the general symptoms? Increasing head size in an infant, chronic recurrent headache, vomiting. The last one which I have said is an important point that a pediatrician has to keep in mind. A change in behavior of the child or a change in school performance. We should always one of the pathological diagnoses, apart from psychiatric issues, a pathological diagnosis that we have to keep in mind is the development of an intracranial space occupying lesion. Now, or localizing, once they have a localizing symptoms, you will definitely think of a ICSOA. The classic triad that we have learned during our undergraduate time, like headache, vomiting, papilledema, are very rare in pediatric age group. So that won't help us in most of the time. Most of the time, it is the change in behavior. Headache, vomiting, cranial palsy. Headache and vomiting, I'm not stressing because if that comes, we'll definitely think of malignancy. The points where we have to think of malignancy is a change in behavior. Another common presentation that we have seen is frequent falls, especially when climbing stairs. This is that can also be a symptom of intracranial space occupying lesion. So, definite history has to be taken before going to imaging studies, because for every headache, imaging may be difficult. So you have to specifically ask for these questions like change in behavior, school performance, change in handwriting, bladder bowel symptoms, gait disturbances, things like that before going into an imaging. Recurrent headache that awakens us from sleep, intense incapacitating pain, and a headache that causes change in quality of life. When this is associated with neurological symptoms, it is a reasonable indication for doing a neuroimaging. Now, when you are doing a neuroimaging, what is the imaging of choice? It is always go for an MRI. MRI has a lot of advantage. One is it is radiation free. Another is posterior foci is clearly seen in the MRI. And when you are suspecting an intracranial space occupying lesion, always order for an MRI brain and spine, because when most of the time what we see is everybody takes an MRI brain, and we have to again make them undergo a second GA to do a spine screening because they may be most of the time associated with spinal deposits as well. Coming to abdominal mass, there is always benign etiologies when you have an abdominal mass, like renal masses that can be benign, hepatic masses, there can be many benign diagnoses. But always work up for a malignancy when you have a benign, when you have an abdominal mass. Here again, the points to be kept in mind is age, history, examination finding, as well as laboratory. Now, coming to what are the points to be kept in mind? Neonatal age, congenital malformations should be kept in mind. Up to 1 to 5 year age group. In a well child presenting with abdominal mass, keep neuroblastoma in mind. A child with constitutional symptoms, keep NHL in mind. Older children, NHL is top in the list. Especially Burkitt lymphoma and abdominal mass associated with biochemical abnormalities suggesting tumor lysis syndrome or presenting with induced assumption. Burkitt lymphoma is your diagnosis. Now, what are the histories to be kept in mind? Constitutional symptoms, think of NHL. Presence of pain and bleeding manifestation, the pain due to bone involvement. Bleeding manifestation due to marrow involvement, think of neuroblastoma. A symptomatic child with hematuria can be a Wilms tumor or an rhabdomyosarcoma. Presence of low birth weight and an abdominal mass, as I have already told, think of hepatoblastoma. Always keep the normal masses that are seen in abdomen in mind when you are examining a child with abdominal mass. Now, look into physical examination. A Wilms tumor, look for aniridia. If you are thinking of renal mass, look for aniridia, hemihypertrophy, genitourinary malformation. If you are thinking of a neuroblastoma, look for subcutaneous nodule, ecchymosis, and neurological manifestations of oxoclonus myoclonus. A child with abdominal mass and a precocious puberty, think of germ cell tumor. So this is an important finding, which unfortunately after coming to RCC, I have seen that many of the time people miss a white eye reflex or a retinoblastoma. We have had patients with white eye reflex who have been kept under follow-up by ophthalmologists, telling that it will recover by itself. I don't know what is the DD in their mind. So one is white eye. Another is a new onset squint. This is a very important point that will be. Because a white eye reflex, if he comes to a pediatrician, I am 100% sure he'll think of retinoblastoma. But another point to be kept in mind is the spin. Because majority of the time when parents tell about spin, we think is what comes to our mind is that child may be having a spin, but parents are recognizing it for the first time. But most of the time, it may be true also. But the point to be kept in mind is a new onset spin that is complained to by a parent in a less than 1 year old. Always make them examined by an ophthalmologist. Have an examination done under anesthesia to look for evidence of retinoblastoma. So this is one point which Santosh sir, I would like IAP to consider also, because probably we should include this in the immunization schedule, because we have in a well baby clinic, we have few visits at day 45, the initial 3 visits, another visit at 9 months, another visit at 1.5 months for immunization. Probably lighting a torch to the eyes and palpating the abdomen to look for any mass should probably become part of that immunization schedule, should become part of that immunization schedule also, so that we can pick up these masses early. We can pick up retinoblastoma early and probably convert that into better outcomes. So any swelling anywhere, malignancy, stop in your DDs. These are few cases which I got from my seniors. Now, once you make a diagnosis of malignancy, what are the things not to do? If you have a renal mass, never attempt a biopsy, not even FNAC to make a diagnosis. If it is a renal mass, send to a pediatric oncologist or send to a pediatric surgeon. Because if you rupture the capsule of a renal mass, it will automatically go into stage 3 and the patient will have to be irradiated. And irradiation in a child has very significant long-term issues. So But if the child goes to a pediatric surgeon and undergoes an nephrectomy, it will become a stage 1, and you can totally avoid irradiation. So a renal mass, don't poke it. Testicular mass, again, don't poke it. If you poke it, it upstages the tumor. Upstage, because the importance in testicular mass is that if you can make it stage 1, they may not need even chemotherapy also. You can treat it by just follow. That is a germ cell tumor that is stage 1. Most of the time does not need chemotherapy also. So, but if you make a biopsy or an FNAC, automatically becomes stage 2. Now, what is role of surgery in a mediastinal mass? As I have already discussed, the first, second, third diagnosis is lymphoma leukemia, and that can be effectively treated with chemotherapy. There is no role of surgery in the management of lymphoma leukemia. We have had patients who has come from big centers who have undergone resection of thoracic mass, and patient has developed major complications like artery paralysis after the surgery, and ultimately the diagnosis came out to be lymphoma. So never attempt. The only role of surgeon in the lymphoma mediastinal mass is for a biopsy. Now, once the diagnosis suspected, what is the next step? The most important step is telling the parents about the diagnosis. So what we have to tell them is that it is a serious diagnosis. We should not tell that it is okay, or we should not tell that it can be 100% treated. But what we have to tell them that it is not like the years. Pediatric malignancies are now treatable. So we have to infuse that hope in their mind before referring to pediatrics oncology center. What are the referral requirements? Discharge summary should always be given. Always mention whether transfusions has been given, whether steroids have been given for any reason during the workup time. Always send the specimen, because this is one point that most of the pediatricians or pediatric surgeons miss. They come here, they will have to again go back to their referral hospital, get the specimen. Always send the specimen along with the patient. So before concluding, I would like to thank Kusuma Madam and Priya Kumari Madam, who have been my mentors and who have provided many of the slides and has given me ideas that has been told today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. It was indeed an enlightening session. And I'd like to now invite Dr. Kiran, Assistant Professor of SCT Hospital, Trivandrum, to deliver a short walk of time.
Any questions? We'll ask questions, because before thanks, because it was a very nice presentation going into all the possible situations, but very simply. The algorithm was very nice. So you are going into the topic, deeper into the topic, but without knowing. So that is a very simple way of presenting this thing. Look very nice. Sir, Santosh sir, Purushothaman sir, any comments and any questions?
I'm Dr. Parvati. Can I say something?
Yes, madam. Yes.
It's just a very good point, a very lucid presentation. And it was a very good point that he has mentioned to look for retinoblastoma and abdominal masses when the baby is coming for immunization. It's a very good point, and we have to.
That can be added to the immunization schedule, so that becomes part of the teaching program. That maybe IAP can take that.
IAP can do that.
One question I want to ask is, when you suspect hematological malignancy, most of the time they will be the bone marrow biopsy. They will again take it in the RCC for the cytological and other things. Should we straightly refer them to RCC, or should we make a diagnosis and refer?
Guru, can you stop the share, Guru, so that we can have good. Okay.
If the diagnosis of malignancy is certain from clinical as well as blood investigations, it is probably best to refer to an oncology center because the bone marrow done in our center will include, apart from the morphology study, we will be sending a cytogenetics study as well as flow cytometry, which may not be present in most of the medical colleges. So that is needed for subtyping the leukemia as well as risk stratification of leukemia. But when you have DDs like connective tissue disorders, in your DD, probably you can attempt a bone marrow biopsy. And once malignancy comes from the diagnosis, you can send to us. But when the CBC and peripheral smear is pointing definitely towards a malignancy, it is better to do the bone marrow in a center where there is flow cytometry as well as cytogenetics.
Within the extension idea, one question I want to ask. Nowadays, I think for all suspected malignancy, flow is a mandatory test.
Definitely, sir.
So in our hospital, and I don't know about the other things, in SIT, we are doing for a strong malignancy case. Can we send the flow cytometry along with the before, means once more testing we can avoid? Because we have done the bone marrow, again it will come as a malignancy, then again I will send to you, again we have to do the bone marrow to the flow. Without flow, you cannot manage. So all suspected cases, ITP just doing rolling, that's okay. In a strong suspicion of malignancy is there, first line itself, can we do a flow cyto?
So that can be done, sir, but that has a practical issue because flow cytometry in RCC, all investigations that come from outside, where there is no malignant diagnosis and the investigation has to be paid by the parents.
Paid by the?
Paid by the parents. Treatment is not free. So if a specimen comes from outside, they will have to pay for the flow cytometry. And flow cytometry in RCC costs around 20,000 rupees, 15 to 20,000 rupees. And cytogenetics workup will cost around 5,000 rupees. So that will be around 20 to 25,000 rupees, both done together. Once they come here and we register in our center, and we have a malignant diagnosis from our center, or we can register them in some government scheme so that they will get the money reimbursed.
Okay, then in flow cytometry, we have to do all markers. 20,000 is very costly. If you do some specific markers, it will be less costly, but you have to do a lot of
time when you're doing leukemia workup, what they do is a leukemia panel, acute leukemia panel. That will include markers for T cell, B cell, myeloid. In myeloid itself, they will be looking for monocytic, erythrocytic, and megakaryocytic markers. So all this panel will be run in the first running. That is how in most of the centers they do. There is a basic panel. So that will include basic markers for B cell, T cell, myeloid. In myeloid, it will include monocytic, erythrocytic, and megakaryocytic. So that will cost around 50,000, 15,000. So, but in private sector, they charge even more than that.
Guru, Purushottam sir is going to ask them.
Guru, that is as usual. There's no need to tell it is excellent. And what I would like to tell is about the way forward about the malignancies in Kerala and the IAP's role. The number of postgraduates in this session of 52 persons, you can see almost 90% of them are senior pediatricians who are already involved in these things. There's no postgraduate students in such forums, and in the coming years, this oncology, pediatric oncology will be favored and learned by very few of the group. And you are going to train those people, but they are not at all taking interest. So in the coming years, oncologists only will be managing the malignancies, definitely, because the advances are that much. I had some experience for a few years. Now I'm not treating, I'm out of the things, and that's why I'm here to learn more from advances. And I'm not confident now because of the 7 years gap. So that's a situation when you people are only going to treat. So what is needed in the coming years is the awareness of what all things you told now, what all precautions to be done when you see a malignancy, what not to do. All these things should be reaching the general pediatrician's level. And two things. One is the early diagnosis and referral and the follow-up later. And that should be that's not happening. How to make this happen? And the other things, the multicentric use of treatment and all. And the other thing is what IAP can do. How to move forward with an integrated manner. Babies in the follow-up in the immunization baby well baby clinic in the we should be definitely involving an ophthalmologist also. It's not enough to do the examination in the well baby clinic by the pediatrician only. Avade CDH miss cheyyunnande or CDH inde awareness inde oru vaanam. Oru ophthalmology inde ee oru karyam, it's more important with the Sikka. If a Sikka vannu, there are a lot of cases which we are missing all over Kerala. It's not confined to Trivandrum only. Sikka and the asymptomatic ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാവും. For the coming years, these timely monitoring from 6 weeks, from including the logistics വെച്ചിട്ട് ഇപ്പൊ ഗുരു പറഞ്ഞ കാര്യം നല്ല കാര്യമാണ്, വാക്സിനേഷന്റെ സമയത്ത് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള കാര്യം. ബട്ട് പീഡിയാട്രീഷ്യൻസ് അവയർനെസ്സും നോക്കേണ്ട ഒരു ചെക്ക് ലിസ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടാവുക. അതോടൊപ്പം maybe other specialties people also should be involved in certain points. Especially we are likely to miss in a very young, below 6 months of malignancies we are missing. And the other area is in the adolescent group. Adolescents, of course, we know it's a great area. Adolescents in ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറയുന്നുണ്ട് നമ്മൾ. അവിടെയുള്ള malignancies-ന്റെ presentations miss ചെയ്യാനുള്ള പോസിബിലിറ്റി ഉണ്ട്. അവിടെ ടെസ്റ്റിന്റെ കാര്യം അവർ പറയൂല എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു, ബാക്കിയുള്ള ചില കാര്യങ്ങൾ മിസ് ചെയ്യാൻ സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ ഓങ്കോളജിന്റെ ഒരു അവയർനെസ്സും ലുക്കിംഗ് ഫോർ malignancy ഓൾസോ ഇൻ ദിസ് വെരി യങ് ആൻഡ് ദി അഡോളസെന്റ് ഗ്രൂപ്പ് ഓൾസോ. അപ്പൊ IAP ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള കുറച്ച് കാര്യങ്ങൾ കൂടി ആ ഫോളോ അപ്പിന്റെ അകത്ത് ഇന്റഗ്രേറ്റ് ചെയ്യണം. സോ ദാറ്റ് ഇൻ ദ കമ്മിങ് ഇയേഴ്സ് നമ്മൾ our target is to pick up malignancy early and refer to the higher centers. Higher centers, nammal parna RCC, Malabar Cancer Center, and all the medical colleges free treatment cancer ധാരണകളൊക്കെ വരുമ്പോൾ അതിന്റെ അകത്ത് നമ്മൾ കുറേ കൂടി മിസ് ചെയ്യാതിരിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് അത് കൂടി ഇൻക്ലൂഡ് ചെയ്യണം. താങ്ക് യു ഗുരു.
ഗുരു, അടുത്തൊരു കാര്യേ, നമ്മുടെ ഹെമി ഹൈപ്പർട്രോഫി പേഷ്യൻസ്, നമുക്ക് 2 പേഷ്യന്റിന് we got a rhabdomyosarcoma. ഗുരുവിന് അറിയാം, all my patients we are sending to you only. But അവിടെ നമ്മൾ ആ പേഷ്യൻസിനെ we were doing ultrasound regularly. Still ഒരു ultrasound കഴിഞ്ഞ് അടുത്ത ultrasound മുമ്പ് they developed a significant rhabdomyosarcoma.
Interval diagnosis.
So it's possible. Once in 3 months on a recommendation. So once in 3 months ultrasound, is it possible to do? What is your experience on that? How? Because I have seen 2 cases with hemi hypertrophy developed rhabdomyosarcoma in spite of ultrasound in once in 4 or 6 months. So every 3 months doing, is it possible? What is your?
So what you told is really correct point. So there is a concept called interval diagnosis, because the patient may be developing malignancy in the time between the interval between the 2 ultrasound. So you will probably lose 2-3 months during that time. But that is an accepted concept, because you cannot.
How commonly it is? How common it is?
But 3-monthly ultrasound is definitely possible, sir, because we are doing 3-monthly ultrasound for almost all of our patients who have completed treatment and are on follow-up for solid tumors like neuroblastoma, Wilms tumor, things like that. We are keeping them under follow-up 3-monthly ultrasound after treatment for the first 2 years of completing treatment. So that is practically possible. Another point is you need an INSYS them to come to our center. They can get the ultrasound done from a local center, and probably they can communicate the result to us with the current availability of Zoom platform, things like that. Probably that was what we did last year when COVID came. COVID has taught us many things. The most important thing is decentralization of cancer care. So most of our patients who are at home are now undergoing follow-up at their local center with ultrasound. and the doctor calls us. We have given our contact number to the parents, and they will. So that is how it is happening. But we don't have any this Beckett or things like patients like that under our follow-up as of now.
The family is still important, sir. Because recently we got a leave from recently family. So how frequently you are seeing that family, entire family is affected with?
Importance of family history in pediatric oncology comes most importantly in retinoblastoma. Most of the other pediatric malignancies do not have a family background. Another important diagnosis, there is a specific diagnosis called the familial neuroblastoma, where they have an ALK mutation. So that is also, but that is a very rare. I think in RCC, in the 30 years experience of RCC, there is only one patient with familial neuroblastoma. But retinoblastoma is one situation where you definitely have a family history, and you need the siblings to be screened up to 5 years of age, and you have to screen the offsprings of this patient also for retinoblastoma in future. Retinoblastoma is the one. Leishmania and all are definite things, but those are glaring things. But retinoblastoma is one where we have to, most of the time we have seen patients missing it. Even now we have one patient who has presented with retinoblastoma, whose father was a retinoblastoma survivor, but they were never informed about a screening. He was childless.
That I think in primary care physicians we have to inform, because I am also getting once in a while cases.
That father was treated by an ophthalmologist. That is not important. Many of the ophthalmologists are treating retinoblastoma, and they never come to us. They even give chemotherapy.
I think more, as from the Purushottam's also, more awareness is required, because we used to see a lot of patients with a testicular feminization syndrome, but 10-15 years back, inguinal hernia was done. At that time, inguinal hernia was done. It was a female. Nobody has even diagnosed it. But the ophthalmologist should be aware of this retinoblastoma. And only now genetic testing can be done, and easily we can do the genetic testing and identify the high-risk people, so that routine screening can be more instituted. I think 2 questions are there. Kiran, Asha Nisamuddin and Kiran.
Okay. Gurchada, the first is by Dr. Asha. There is a child with bone pain. One is of acute onset, and other situation where the bone pain is of a chronic duration. So is there a change in approach regarding the symptoms? Is possible that whether the chronicity of symptoms will it make it less likely to be a malignancy?
That was the point I was going to tell. Because a chronic pain is unlikely to be malignant. Most of the malignancies that present with bone pain have an acute presentation. The most common is leukemia lymphoma. An Ewing sarcoma or an osteosarcoma can have a duration of presentation of around 3 to 4 months. So that if you can call that chronic, that is an important thing. But those pains are usually localized. So pain that is localized to a single bone, most of the time we will take an X-ray and we will work out. So a chronic bone pain is less likely to be malignancy. A generalized chronic bone pain, localized can still be bone tumors, and LCH can also present in a similar fashion.
So the second question is, when there is a significant cervical lymphadenopathy, can we compare FNAC with a biopsy?
It is always FNAC. It is always biopsy. FNAC is not an answer when you have malignancy in your DD, because most of the time when you, I will take the most common situation where this causes an issue, which is Hodgkin's syndrome. If you take a Hodgkin's lymph node, only 5% of the lymph node cells are composed of Hodgkin cells. The rest of 95% of cells are like reactive cells. So when you do an FNAC, you are always likely to take only the reactive cells. The likelihood of you catching the Reed-Sternberg cell is almost negligible, because 95% of cell in the lymph node of a Hodgkin's disease patient is reactive cell, and the Hodgkin cell is less than 5% of the bulk of the tumor. It is basically the reactive infiltrates that causes the adenopathy. So to see the Reed-Sternberg cell, you have to take a biopsy and see the cross section. Otherwise, you will definitely miss a malignant diagnosis. Another is you have to look at if in an NHL, you have to, the most important point in making a diagnosis of a non-Hodgkin lymphoma is loss of architecture of the lymph node, which we will not see in an FNAC. We cannot see the architecture in an FNAC. For that also you need a biopsy. It's always biopsy. And if you ask me whether the biopsy has to be true cut or excision biopsy, the answer is excision biopsy. But at least it should be a true cut biopsy and never FNAC to make a malignancy diagnosis.
So the third question is regarding the success of leukemia treatment in RCC and chance for second malignancy in survivors in maybe the RCC experience.
I think that question is from Shija, madam.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I didn't ask. Someone else.
Okay. We have looked into ALL survival, and most of the disease individually we are looked into survival. ALL at our center has a survival around 70 to 75%, which in a developed country like US or UK, it is around 85 to 95%. So the difference in survival is probably mostly due to the infection-related issues. And there are data coming that ALL in India has a more bad biology. There are data from TMH saying that the biology of ALL in India is different from that seen in Western countries. So that may also be contributing to the poorer survival in our country. Most of the other malignancies we have survival similar to Western statistics like Wilms tumor, Hodgkin, things like that. We have survival around medulloblastoma. We have survival around 85 to 90%. Wilms tumor, we have survival around more than 90%. Solid tumors like bone tumors, Ewing sarcoma and osteosarcoma, our survival is 50%. 50% is survival, but in Western statistics, it's around 60 to 65%. It is little less than Western statistics, but it is comparable. Coming to second malignancies, actually we have started seeing the second malignancies because survivors of yesteryears are now coming with the second malignancy. Definitely we have started to see second malignancies and long-term issues. Other than second malignancies are also coming up. The most common long-term issues include, most important one is psychosocial issues, because these children are too much cared for, and during their development age they lose their school years, so they find much difficulty in adjusting with peers because of the loss of school years. So what we do now is that we definitely encourage them to go to school while on treatment when they are on maintenance therapy. Not during the intensive phase for sure, but during the maintenance therapy, we are telling them to go to school. Another issue is cardiomyopathy, which is seen in tumors which receive anthracycline, especially in solid tumors like osteosarcoma. We have had a few cases of cardiomyopathy who are undergoing treatment for the same. Many children who survive medulloblastoma have hearing issues, but fortunately, most of the time, the hearing issue is not affecting their routine life. Another is cranial radiation seen in medulloblastoma have neurocognitive and endocrine issues. Almost all survivors of medulloblastoma have some endocrine issues like hypothyroidism, growth hormone issues, sexual dysfunction, things like that are there in almost all survivors of medulloblastoma, because the cranial radiation given in medulloblastoma is a very high dose cranial radiation. Leukemia survivors, majority of them have the long-term issues, is psychosocial issues. Otherwise, cardiac issues is very rare. The cranial radiation doses have come down very much. So, and neuroendocrine issues are less. But recently we have analyzed metabolic syndrome has been seen in survivors of leukemia.
Guru, one thing regarding this question itself. We are treating leukemia patients till 2013. And in 90s, late 90s, we had 2 cases of promyelocytic leukemia. At that time, we could mobilize all-trans retinoic acid, and one child died The other child survived. We could manage the transglutamic acid for the complete course, and she was all right. And now she's almost 26 years, got married, and child is almost 4 years. So he's perfectly healthy. My doubt is, what about, we had many other survivors, and a few of them, girl children, they didn't reveal this thing to the family. That sort of things are also there. Some of them didn't reveal the history. So that is one problem. Every year we used to call them for a get together at that time. Now for the last 2 years, it's not happening. The girls won't be coming, and there's a problem with the social things, marriage and all. So what about the follow-up? How long we should be followed up, especially these unusual drugs like transglutamic acid? Will there be any provision for following up for that, and the kiddos? That is
in survivors of as you said, promyelocytic leukemia is acute leukemia, very good survivor. At our center, we have survival around 80%. Most of the time, the death occurs in promyelocytic leukemia at initial presentation. The death is most often not due to malignancy, it is due to DIC. DIC is the cause of death in majority of promyelocytic leukemia. Once they survive that intensive phase of treatment, majority relapses are very rare. If I look back from 2012, after which I joined in RCC, I remember only 2 cases of promyelocytic leukemia relapsing. And every year we have at least 5 to 7 cases of promyelocytic leukemia, of which only 2 relapsed, and in one of them, the relapse we have treated, and that is still surviving. So promyelocytic leukemia is a disease with good progress. Now coming to social issues after in the survivors. So that is one definite problem in survivors, because cancer being a stigma, parents most of the time come to RCC without even telling their neighbors, and they get treated here and go back. But one point to be known is that many of them who get married after them have children, they have kids. There is no data suggesting that a survivor of malignancy will, the kids of survivors of malignancy have an increased risk of malignancy. There is no such data. But pregnancy-related issues have been documented in many of the malignancies, like preterm deliveries, pregnancy losses have been reported. But there is no data of increased risk of malignancy in survivors. We have many survivors who have offsprings and they are healthy. And one of the social aspects, I will tell one event that Kusuma madam has once told me. One of her madam once went to a marriage function, and she saw one of the survivors of RCC there. And madam, when they saw them, madam was happy to see, and madam was going to talk to them, but they didn't look at madam. They just walked away. So madam was a little concerned. That was during the early years of madam's career. But in the next week, that parent and that child came to RCC. They didn't have a follow-up, but they came to RCC and told sorry to madam for not looking at. They told we didn't look at you, ma'am, because none of our relatives knows that our child is a survivor. Now, if you happen to talk to me at the marriage function, everybody will ask me how I know you. So I will have to explain all those things. So that is a stigma in our society.
Another bad experience with us is many of those recovered and followers had hepatitis B.
Definitely, definitely that is.
Recently, I learned two lessons I learned recently, not earlier. It's a 15-year-old boy came with paraplegia and there was no bowel bar disturbances, paresis only, not much. Sudden onset of previously he had some low backache and all on a sudden this developed, and there was the periporous smear was normal, ESR was not that high, nothing to suggest. So in the lateral view of this thing, there was a collapse of single vertebra. And we considered the possibility of this thing. And I think the bone marrow was also not convincing. And we considered the Langerhans as a possibility. In that situation, isolated one bone only.
Very common.
And what happened was, after surgery, the curetted specimen showed it was a leukemia.
Okay.
That is one experience. Another one, a girl child of 6 years who presented the dental department with the blackish this thing, the swelling there, and they removed the teeth, and the blackish stuff was there, and the biopsy was done, and the biopsy showed, and they gave a diagnosis of actinomycosis. And we put the patient on corticline penicillin for 1 month. And what happened was, after 4 or 5 months, it turned out to be the other thing, the lymphoma, Burkitt's lymphoma.
Burkitt.
That was
Yeah,
from Kottayam. You must be knowing. So they're all experiences.
Completed treatment yesterday, sir.
That's because histopathological proof they're giving actinomycosis, and we don't have anything. At the end, it turns out to be something. So,
diagnosed as anaplastic large cell lymphoma.
Yeah.
So ALCL is one diagnosis that can mimic many pediatric conditions. We have had many chronic lymphadenopathy, chronic in the sense 1 or 2 months lymphadenopathy turning out to be anaplastic large cell lymphoma. So that is one malignancy that can mimic an infectious condition, because anaplastic large cell lymphoma has a property of infiltrating into the skin and forming sinuses. So most of them will be worked up again and again for TB and fungal infections. So only way of diagnosing is biopsy. You have to biopsy it.
in fact, actinomycosis as a diagnosis I have never heard during all these 35 years. First time I got a diagnosis like this, I was wondering in this age group. Anyway, I had to believe this thing, and we gave treatment, but ultimately it was again wrong.
It was an ALCL.
I was reminded of a case. We had a survivor, a girl child, and at the age of 12, 13, she, during the period of menarche, she developed severe bleeding, and it turned out to be genital malignancy. And another case, we had thinking of Still's disease with hepatosplenomegaly, small joint swellings, and it turned out to be acute myeloid leukemia. So many experience, but now the PGs don't get a chance to see these cases, because not seeing the cases, but treating, because all the cases are referred to RCC mostly.
That is what Purushottam was telling. It should be part of curriculum. It should be brought in.
So it may be better to post them at least for 2 weeks, and the postgraduates can be posted in RCC for 2 weeks from all the government medical.
To be frank,
And already under final year 15 days they are posted in RCC.
Sir, I definitely feel 2 weeks is a very small time.
2 weeks is a very small time. At least they can get awareness, that's all.
Yes.
Very excellent talk. Yes.
There are no more questions. Kiran will give you a lot of thanks.
Okay. So I know Dr. Guru Prasad or Gurchetan as my senior PG, and then later as a senior resident, then in faculty of the RCC, and of course our central striker of our Trivandrum IAP football team. So he has been very sincere and meticulous in all his activities, be it in the academics or patient care or football. So as expected, it was a very exhaustive and elegant talk, but at the same time, very simple for everyone to understand, and also most importantly to practice as in their practice. And so even though we all consider him still a part of our SAT family, still I would like to thank him on behalf of our department and myself for giving us this lecture series. I would also like to thank Santosh Kumar sir, President of Trivandrum IAP, for introducing the speaker. Then I would also like to thank Trivandrum IAP for sharing this platform. And of course, I would like to thank all the senior teachers, Purushottam sir, Ajit sir, Shankar sir, and all the senior faculties and fellow pediatricians for also offering a different perspective on this pediatric oncology topic. And so I would like to thank all of you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kiran.
Thank you, Guru Prasad.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Purushothaman sir.
Purushothaman sir, thank you, boy. Okay. Guru, fine.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Santosh, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay.